The grand hall of the Camden Concert House was filled with the sound of clinking glasses and quiet laughter, but the air near the stage had turned sharp and cold. Julian Voss stood in the center of a small circle of admirers, his black jacket pressed to perfection, his voice carrying just loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Tonight's program is a disgrace," he said, waving a hand toward the piano. "Charity or not, someone should tell these organizers that talent cannot be invented. It is born or it is not." The guests around him laughed nervously, unsure whether to agree or feel embarrassed. Julian was the reason half of them had come. He was the most celebrated pianist in the city, a man whose name filled concert halls and whose photograph appeared on the covers of music magazines. He had earned his place, and he never let anyone forget it. Near the back of the hall, close to the stage curtains, a woman in a plain gray dress moved quietly between tables, straightening chairs and adjusting the flower arrangements. Her name was Maria Santos. She had worked at the Camden Concert House for 15 years, first as a cleaner, later taking on the extra task of tuning the old grand piano that stood at the center of the stage. Most people in the hall did not know her name. To them, she was simply part of the furniture, someone who kept the building running while important people did important things. Maria did not mind being invisible. She had learned long ago that being seen came with a price she was not always willing to pay. She kept her head down, did her work well, and left before the guests noticed her at all. But tonight, something was different. The event organizer, a cheerful man named Edward Hall, was rushing between tables with a clipboard in his hand, his forehead damp with worry. One of the scheduled performers, a young violinist, had fallen ill and could not make it. The program had a hole in it, right in the middle of the evening, and the guests were starting to grow restless. "We need something," Edward muttered to himself, scanning the room. "Anything." His eyes landed on Maria, who was tightening a loose screw on the piano bench. He remembered, almost by accident, a conversation from years ago, when Maria had once played a few notes on the piano late at night, thinking she was alone. He had listened from the doorway, stunned by what he heard, though he had never mentioned it to her again. "Maria," he said, hurrying over. "I need a favor. Can you play something? Just a short piece. To fill the gap. Nothing fancy." Maria's hands stopped moving. She looked at him as though he had asked her to walk across the ceiling. "Edward, I clean this hall. I don't perform in it." "Please," he said, his voice pleading. 5 minutes. That's all I need." Maria hesitated, glancing toward the stage, then toward the crowd of well-dressed guests who had no idea she existed. Something in her chest tightened, an old feeling she had buried a long time ago. Finally, she gave a small nod. Edward's relief lasted only a moment before Julian, who had overheard the exchange from a few steps away, let out a short, sharp laugh. "The cleaning woman is going to perform?" he said, loud enough for half the room to hear. Well, this evening just became far more interesting. The room fell into an awkward hush. A few guests smiled uncomfortably. Others turned to look at Maria, seeing her for the first time, not as a person, but as a subject of amusement. Maria felt her face grow warm, but she did not look away. She had faced worse than the mockery of a stranger. Julian stepped closer, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He was not truly cruel, not in the way some people are, but years of praise and applause had convinced him that his talent placed him above ordinary judgment and ordinary people. He saw Maria's plain dress, her tired hands, the quiet way she carried herself, and he made a decision about her worth in less than a second. "Tell me," he said, addressing the crowd as much as her, "do you even know how to read music, or do you simply enjoy sitting at the piano while you dust it?" A ripple of laughter spread through the nearest tables. Edward opened his mouth to defend her, but Maria raised a hand slightly, stopping him. "I know how to read music," she said calmly. "I have known since I was 7 years old." "How charming," Julian said. "A childhood hobby. I'm sure it will be a delightful little interlude before the real performers return." The word real hit harder than he perhaps intended. Maria's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "You seem very certain about what I can and cannot do," she said. "For someone who has never heard me play a single note." For a brief moment, something flickered across Julian's face, a flash of surprise at her composure. He had expected embarrassment, perhaps a stammered apology, not quiet defiance. He recovered quickly, folding his arms. "Then let us test that certainty," he said, his eyes gleaming with the challenge of it. "You and I, at the piano, tonight. Let the audience decide who belongs on that stage." A murmur ran through the crowd, equal parts shock and excitement. Edward's eyes went wide with alarm. This was not the small favor he had asked for. This had become something else entirely. Something with an audience, a winner, and a loser. Julian, that's really not necessary, Edward said quickly. She only agreed to fill a gap in the program, not to. It's fine, Edward, Maria said, cutting him off gently. Every head at the nearby tables turned toward her. Julian raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting her to accept so easily. You're agreeing to this? He asked, a note of disbelief creeping into his voice. Maria looked at him steadily, the tiredness in her eyes replaced by something sharper, something that had been sleeping for a very long time, and had just been woken. Yes, she said, I am. Julian let out a short laugh, more from surprise than amusement now. He turned to the crowd, spreading his arms as though presenting a grand announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, it appears we have a duel, he said. Julian Voss against the woman who tunes my piano. How wonderfully unexpected. Some guests clapped, delighted by the sudden drama. Others exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that something about the moment did not sit right, though they could not quite say what. Edward stood frozen, torn between stopping the whole thing and trusting that Maria knew what she was doing. Maria did not smile. She did not look nervous either. She simply turned toward the piano, the very instrument she had tuned 100 times in the quiet hours after the guests had gone home, and studied it, as though seeing it for the first time in years. Julian, meanwhile, was already accepting congratulations from the circle of admirers around him, basking in the attention, certain that within minutes this strange contest would end exactly as he expected. He pictured Maria fumbling through a simple scale, the crowd offering polite, pitying applause, and the evening returning to normal, with his position at the top of the room fully restored. He had no idea that the woman standing quietly by the piano had once dreamed of a life on stages far grander than this one, a dream that had been taken from her before she ever had the chance to prove what she could do. Word of the challenge spread through the hall like fire through dry grass. Waiters paused mid-step to whisper to each other. Guests who had been heading toward the exit turned back, drawn by the promise of unexpected entertainment. Within minutes, nearly everyone in the Camden Concert House knew that the celebrated Julian Voss had challenged the building's own cleaning woman to a piano duel, and almost no one believed it would be a fair fight. Edward pulled Maria aside for a brief moment, his voice low and urgent. You don't have to do this, he said. I can put a stop to it right now. Maria glanced toward Julian, who was laughing with his friends, utterly convinced of his coming victory. Something in her expression hardened, quiet but unmistakable. No, she said softly. I think it's time I did. Edward studied her face, searching for the fear he expected to find there. Instead, he found something else, a calm certainty that unsettled him more than panic would have. He had known Maria for 15 years, and had never once heard her speak about her past. Whatever memory had just surfaced behind her eyes, he understood, in that moment, that this contest had become about far more than a 5-minute favor. The stage lights dimmed slightly, and a hush began to settle over the crowd, as the seating was rearranged to face the piano directly. Julian took his position first, adjusting his cufflinks with theatrical precision, milking every second of attention the room offered him. Maria stood near the side of the stage, her hands folded in front of her, watching him with an expression no one in the room could quite read. Somewhere behind that calm face, memories were stirring that had been locked away for over 20 years. Memories of a girl who once sat at a piano bench with trembling hands and a heart full of hope, before life pulled her in a different direction entirely. The room grew quiet. The duel was about to begin, and no one in that hall, including Julian Voss himself, had any idea what was about to happen. By the next morning, the story of the piano duel had traveled far beyond the walls of the Camden Concert House. Guests who had witnessed the challenge could not stop talking about it, and within a day, a local newspaper writer named Charlotte Bennett had heard 3 different versions of the same tale from 3 different sources. She decided the story was too strange to ignore, and she began asking questions. Charlotte arrived at the concert hall in the early afternoon, notebook in hand, hoping to speak with anyone who had been present the night before. She found Edward Hall in his cramped office behind the stage, surrounded by stacks of paperwork and half-finished cups of coffee. Is it true? She asked, without bothering with introductions. Julian Voss challenged a cleaning woman to a piano duel? Edward rubbed his temples, clearly still recovering from the events of the previous evening. It's true, he said, though I still don't fully understand how it happened. And she accepted? She did. Charlotte's pen moved quickly across her notebook. Do you think she has any chance against him? He's performed in front of thousands of people. He's played in concert halls across the country. Edward paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've known Maria for 15 years, he said. "I clean this building's finances, I schedule its events, and I thought I knew everyone who works here. But last night, I saw something in her eyes I had never seen before. I don't know what will happen at that piano, but I don't think it will be what anyone expects." Charlotte left the office more curious than when she arrived, and by that evening, a short article about the upcoming duel had appeared in the local paper, drawing even more attention to an event that had started as nothing more than an insult exchanged between two strangers. Julian, for his part, treated the growing attention as nothing more than confirmation of his own importance. He spent the following days giving brief interviews, always with the same confident tone, always framing the duel as a small act of generosity on his part. "I simply want to give this woman a chance to be heard," he told one radio host, his voice smooth and practiced. "Not everyone gets the opportunity to perform beside someone of my experience. I think it will be a valuable lesson for her, win or lose." Behind the polished words, Julian genuinely believed what he was saying. He was not trying to be unkind, not in his own mind. He had built his entire identity around the idea that greatness in music came from years of formal training, prestigious teachers, and stages earned through relentless discipline. A woman who spent her days cleaning concert halls did not fit into that picture, no matter how calmly she had spoken to him. His manager, a sharp-featured man named Henry Baxter, was less convinced that this was a harmless bit of theater. Henry had managed Julian's career for nearly a decade, and he had learned to read the small signs of trouble long before they became public disasters. "I don't like this," Henry said, pacing back and forth in Julian's apartment, a glass of water forgotten in his hand. "You've turned a charity gala into a public spectacle. If this woman plays even reasonably well, people will say you humiliated her for sport. If she plays poorly, people will say you bullied someone who never had a real chance to begin with. There is no version of this where you come out looking generous." Julian waved off the concern with the ease of a man who had never truly failed at anything in his professional life. "You worry too much, Henry. I've performed under far greater pressure than this. A woman who tunes pianos for a living is not going to shake my reputation." Henry studied his client for a long moment, noting the certainty in his posture, the complete absence of doubt. It was the same confidence that had carried Julian to the top of his profession, and the same confidence Henry feared might one day lead him somewhere he could not easily return from. Meanwhile, across the city, Maria's life had also been disrupted, though in a quieter, more private way. She continued reporting to work each day, continued tuning the piano and arranging the chairs, but something inside her had shifted the moment she agreed to Julian's challenge. That night, after finishing her shift, she walked home slowly through streets she had walked 1,000 times before, her mind traveling back to a place she rarely allowed herself to visit. 23 years earlier, a much younger Maria had been a student at a respected conservatory, one of the most promising pianists in her class. Her teacher, an elderly woman named Professor Alice Winters, had often told her that she possessed a rare gift, the kind of talent that came along perhaps once in a generation. Maria had dreamed of concert stages, of recordings, of a life spent entirely inside the world of music. Then, within the space of a single year, everything had changed. Her father had fallen seriously ill, and the family's small income could no longer cover both his care and her tuition. Her younger brother needed support to finish his own schooling. Maria, the eldest, made the decision without hesitation, though it broke something inside her that never fully healed. She left the conservatory, took whatever work she could find, and slowly, piece by piece, set aside the dream that had once defined her entire future. She had never blamed her family for the sacrifice. She loved them, and she would have made the same choice again without a second thought. But there had always been a small, quiet part of her that wondered what might have happened if circumstances had been different, if she had been allowed to walk the path she had once worked so hard to build. For over 2 decades, that part of her had remained buried, tucked away beneath years of practical living. She had told herself, more times than she could count, that the dream was gone, that dwelling on it served no purpose. And yet, standing in that concert hall the night before, listening to Julian's dismissive words, something long dormant had opened its eyes. Maria sat at her small kitchen table that evening, her hands resting on the wooden surface as though it were a keyboard. Slowly, almost without thinking, her fingers began to move, tracing the pattern of a piece she had not played in over 20 years. The notes existed only in her mind, but her body remembered every motion perfectly, as though no time had passed at all. Her daughter Grace, a bright-eyed young woman in her early 20s, walked into the kitchen and paused at the sight of her mother's moving hands. "Mom, what are you doing?" Maria looked up, a faint smile crossing her face, remembering something I thought I had forgotten. Grace pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. She had grown up hearing fragments of her mother's past, small details mentioned in passing, but never the full story. "Is this about the duel? Edward called the house earlier." He sounded worried. Maria's smile widened slightly. "Edward worries about everything." "Mom?" Grace's voice grew more serious. "Can you actually play? Like really play? Well enough to stand next to someone like Julian Voss?" Maria was quiet for a long moment, her eyes drifting toward the window, toward the darkening sky outside. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight Grace had never heard in it before. "There was a time," Maria said slowly, "when people believed I could have played on any stage in this country. I gave that up for good reasons, reasons I have never once regretted. But I never stopped loving the piano. Even after I stopped performing, I kept it inside me, quietly, for 23 years. Grace stared at her mother, seeing her, in that instant, as something more than the tired, hard-working woman she had known her entire life. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because the past is easier to carry when you don't look at it too closely," Maria said. "But Julian looked at me last night and decided he already knew everything about who I was. He decided my worth before he ever heard a single note. I spent so many years accepting that kind of judgment quietly. I am done accepting it." Grace reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "Then show him." Maria nodded slowly, her resolve settling into place like a key turning in a long locked door. "I intend to." Over the following days, while Julian continued his interviews and public appearances, confident and untroubled, Maria began a quiet transformation of her own. Each night after finishing her work at the concert hall, she stayed behind for an extra hour, alone on the very stage where the duel would take place. She sat at the piano she had tuned so many times, and for the first time in over 2 decades, she allowed herself to truly play. Her fingers were rusty at first, stumbling over passages that had once come easily to her, but with each passing evening, the years of absence began to fall away. Muscle memory, buried deep but never fully erased, began to resurface. The emotion she had suppressed for so long poured out through the keys, filling the empty hall with music that no one else was there to hear. Edward discovered her one night by accident, staying late to finish paperwork, drawn toward the stage by a sound he almost did not recognize as coming from the same building he managed every day. He stood in the shadows near the back of the hall, listening in stunned silence as Maria played a piece full of sorrow and strength, her eyes closed, completely lost in the music. When she finished, the final note hanging in the air, Edward stepped forward, applauding softly. Maria startled, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment at being caught in such a private moment. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I should have asked before staying late to use the hall." "Maria," Edward said, his voice unsteady with disbelief. "In 15 years, I never had any idea. Not once. I didn't want anyone to know," she admitted. "It was easier that way." Edward sat down on the edge of the stage, studying her with newfound respect. "Whatever happens on the night of that duel," he said, "I want you to know something. You have nothing to prove to Julian Voss. But if you want to prove something to yourself, I believe you already have everything you need." Maria looked down at her hands, the same hands that spent their days scrubbing floors and dusting shelves, hands that had just poured 2 decades of buried longing into a piece of music more beautiful than anything the Camden Concert House had heard in years. "There is something I need to prove," she said quietly. "Not to him, to the girl I used to be." As the night of the duel approached, the city buzzed with anticipation. Tickets to the rescheduled charity event sold out within hours, driven by curiosity about the strange contest that had captured public attention. Julian continued to believe, right up until the final hour, that the evening would end exactly as he expected, with polite applause for a well-meaning amateur, and a return to his rightful place at the center of attention. He had no way of knowing that somewhere across the city, a woman who had spent 15 years unnoticed was preparing to remind him, and everyone else in that hall, that talent does not always announce itself with fame or titles. Sometimes it waits patiently in the shadows, tuning pianos it was once meant to play, until the right moment arrives to be heard again. The night of the duel arrived with a kind of electricity that the Camden Concert House had rarely felt before. Every seat in the hall was filled, and extra chairs had been added along the back walls to accommodate the crowd. Reporters lined the side aisles, cameras ready, while ordinary guests whispered among themselves, exchanging theories about what was about to unfold. Charlotte Bennett sat near the front, her notebook open on her lap, watching the stage with sharp attention. She had spent the past week gathering small details about both competitors, though Maria had remained largely silent, declining every request for an interview. Julian, in contrast, had given several, each one dripping with confidence. Backstage, in a small dressing room reserved for performers, Julian adjusted his tie in the mirror, his reflection calm and composed. Henry Baxter stood behind him, arms crossed, his expression far less relaxed. "Last chance to reconsider," Henry said. "You could withdraw gracefully. Say you didn't want to embarrass a woman who never asked for this kind of spotlight." Julian turned from the mirror, a faint smile on his lips. "Withdraw? Henry, I built my entire career on moments like this. The crowd wants a show, and I intend to give them one." Henry sighed, but said nothing further. He had learned long ago that once Julian set his mind on something, no argument could shift it. In a separate room down the hall, Maria sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed. She wore a simple dark blue dress, nothing extravagant, nothing designed to draw attention beyond what her music would earn on its own. Grace sat beside her, gently squeezing her hand. "Are you nervous?" Grace asked softly. Maria opened her eyes, and there was a calm steadiness in them that surprised even her daughter. "I was nervous, 23 years ago, the last time I sat in a room like this, waiting to perform. Tonight I feel something different. Tonight I feel ready." A soft knock came at the door, and Edward peered inside, his face pale with nervous energy. "They're ready for you both. The hall is completely full." Maria rose slowly, smoothing the front of her dress. Grace stood as well, wrapping her arms around her mother in a brief, tight embrace. "Whatever happens out there," Grace whispered, "I am so proud of you already." Maria smiled, a genuine quiet smile that held 23 years of buried hope within it. "Thank you, my dear. Now let's go remind an old dream what it feels like to breathe." The lights in the main hall dimmed, and a hush spread across the audience as Edward walked to the center of the stage, a small microphone in hand. He cleared his throat, his voice trembling slightly with the weight of the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight for what has become, quite unexpectedly, one of the most talked about evenings in this hall's history. Tonight, we witness a contest between two very different musicians. On one side, a performer known across the country for his skill and his many years on the world's finest stages. On the other, a woman who has spent 15 years caring for this very building, and whose story, I believe, is about to surprise every single one of us." The audience applauded politely, curiosity written across every face. Edward gestured toward the wings, and Julian emerged first, striding onto the stage with the easy confidence of a man who had performed in front of far larger crowds 100 times before. He bowed deeply, soaking in the applause that followed, before taking his place at the piano. "I will begin," Julian announced, his voice carrying effortlessly through the hall, with a piece that demands both precision and passion. "I hope it reminds everyone here why true mastery takes a lifetime to build." He placed his hands on the keys, and the hall fell silent. What followed was, by any measure, a remarkable performance. Julian's fingers moved across the keyboard with breathtaking speed, executing a difficult and technically demanding piece filled with rapid runs and dramatic flourishes. The music built and swelled, filled with the kind of showmanship that had made him famous, every note precise, every transition seamless. When he finished, striking the final chord with theatrical flair, the audience rose in a wave of enthusiastic applause. Julian stood, bowing once more, clearly pleased with himself. He glanced toward the wings, where Maria waited quietly, and offered her a small, almost pitying smile, as though bracing the audience for the disappointment about to follow. "A wonderful performance," Edward said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "And now, please welcome Maria Santos." Maria walked onto the stage, and for a brief moment, the applause that greeted her was polite but restrained, tinged with the same skepticism Julian had displayed from the very beginning. She did not rush. She walked to the piano bench with the same calm, deliberate steps she used every night when she tuned that very instrument, and settled herself in front of the keys. She looked out at the audience, at the sea of curious and doubtful faces, and for a brief moment, her eyes found Grace sitting near the front, offering a small, encouraging nod. Maria took a breath, closed her eyes, and let her hands fall gently onto the keys. The first notes that emerged were soft, almost hesitant, and a few people in the audience exchanged uncertain glances, wondering if this was the beginning of the awkward, amateurish performance many had expected. But within a few measures, something shifted. The soft notes deepened, gaining weight and shape, unfolding into a piece of extraordinary emotional depth. It was a composition few in the audience recognized, a piece written decades earlier by Professor Alice Winters, Maria's old conservatory teacher. A piece Maria herself had learned as a young student and had never fully forgotten, even through 23 years of silence. The music told a story without words, a story of hope, of loss, of sacrifice, and of a love for something that refused to die no matter how long it was set aside. Maria's fingers moved with a fluid grace that belied years of absence from formal practice. Every note carried weight, every phrase breathed with genuine feeling, the kind of feeling that cannot be taught, only lived. The audience, initially uncertain, grew utterly still, drawn into the current of sound flowing from the stage. Julian, standing near the side of the stage where he had positioned himself to watch, felt the confident smile slowly fade from his face. He had expected clumsy fingers, hesitant timing, the unmistakable marks of someone who had never received formal training. Instead, he heard control, nuance, and something even more difficult to achieve than technical perfection, a performance filled with genuine, aching emotion. He recognized the piece almost immediately, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. It was one of Professor Winters's lesser-known compositions, rarely performed publicly, known mostly within certain circles of serious musicians who had studied her work closely. For Maria to know this piece, to play it with such intimate understanding, meant she had trained far beyond the level of a casual hobbyist. As the piece built toward its emotional peak, Maria's hands moved faster, weaving through complex passages with an ease that silenced any remaining doubt in the room. Tears formed in the eyes of several audience members, moved by the raw honesty pouring out of the music. Grace watched her mother from her seat, her own eyes glistening, pride swelling in her chest as she witnessed, for the first time, the full scope of the talent her mother had kept hidden for so long. Charlotte scribbled furiously in her notebook, barely able to keep pace with her own racing thoughts. This was not the story she had expected to write. This was something else entirely, something far more powerful than a simple contest between two performers. The piece began its final descent, the notes softening, slowing, carrying the weight of 23 years of longing toward a gentle, aching resolution. Maria's hands lifted from the keys as the last note faded into silence, and for a long moment, the hall remained utterly quiet, the audience still lost in the emotional wake of what they had just witnessed. Then, as if a spell had broken, the silence shattered into thunderous applause. The audience rose to their feet almost in unison, the sound of clapping and cheering filling every corner of the hall. Grace was on her feet immediately, tears streaming freely down her cheeks, clapping harder than anyone around her. Edward stood near the side of the stage, his hand pressed to his chest, overwhelmed by what he had just witnessed from a woman he thought he had known completely for 15 years. Maria remained seated for a moment longer, her eyes closed, allowing herself to feel the full weight of the moment, a moment she had waited 23 years to reclaim. When she finally opened her eyes and rose from the bench, she found herself facing a standing ovation, unlike anything the Camden Concert House had witnessed in years. Julian stood frozen near the side of the stage, his earlier confidence completely drained from his posture. He stared at Maria as though seeing her for the very first time, the polished smugness that had defined his every word over the past week utterly gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably like shame. He had walked into this contest, certain of an easy, effortless victory, certain that his years of formal training and prestigious performances placed him on a level far beyond anything a cleaning woman could achieve. Instead, he had just witnessed a performance that surpassed his own in every measure that truly mattered, not in technical flash, but in genuine, soul-deep artistry. The applause continued for nearly a full minute before Edward finally stepped forward, raising his hands to gently quiet the crowd. His voice, when he spoke, trembled with emotion he made no effort to hide. "I think," he said slowly, "we have all just witnessed something none of us will forget." The audience murmured in agreement, many still wiping tears from their eyes. All eyes turned toward Julian, waiting to see how the man who had orchestrated this entire contest would respond to an outcome he clearly had not anticipated. Julian stood motionless for a long moment, his mind racing through the events of the past week. The mocking words he had spoken so carelessly, the confident interviews he had given, all built on an assumption he now understood to be completely, painfully wrong. He looked at Maria, who stood quietly at the center of the stage, not gloating, not seeking further attention, simply standing with the same calm dignity she had carried since the very beginning. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Julian Voss did not know what to say. The applause finally settled into a quiet murmur, the audience still watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Julian remained near the side of the stage, his hands loose at his sides, his usual composure nowhere to be found. Every eye in the hall was fixed on him, waiting for a response to a moment he had never once imagined having to face. He took a slow step forward, then another, until he stood near the center of the stage, close to where Maria waited quietly. The silence stretched long enough that a few uncomfortable coughs echoed from the back rows before Julian finally spoke, his voice noticeably softer than it had been all week. "That piece," he said, looking directly at Maria. "I recognized it. It belongs to Professor Alice Winters. Very few people outside serious conservatory circles even know it exists." Maria met his gaze steadily. "She was my teacher," she said simply. "A long time ago." A ripple of surprise passed through the audience, whispers spreading from row to row. Charlotte leaned forward in her seat, pen poised, sensing the true heart of the story finally beginning to reveal itself. "Your teacher," Julian repeated slowly, as though testing the weight of the words. "Then you studied formally. You trained." "I did," Maria said. "At the same conservatory many respected musicians in this city once attended. I was a student there for 3 years." Julian's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession: surprise, confusion, and finally, something that looked very much like dawning shame. "Then why?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost private despite the packed hall listening to every word. "Why have you spent 15 years cleaning this building, instead of performing in it?" Maria was quiet for a long moment, her eyes drifting briefly toward Grace, who watched her from the front row with unwavering support. When she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm honesty that had defined her entire performance. "My father became very ill when I was 20 years old," she said. "My family could not afford both his care and my tuition. I made a choice, and I have never regretted it. I left the conservatory to work, to help my family survive a difficult time. Music remained something I loved, but it became something I could no longer afford to pursue as a career." The hall had grown so quiet that Maria's voice reached every corner without need for amplification. Even the reporters near the side aisles had stopped writing, caught up entirely in the unfolding truth. "For 15 years, Maria continued, I have worked in this building, tuning the very piano I once dreamed of performing on. I told myself it was enough simply to be near the music, even if I could never again stand where you are standing tonight." Julian's shoulders sagged slightly, the last remnants of his earlier arrogance draining away completely. He thought back to every dismissive word he had spoken over the past week, every mocking comment made in front of friends and reporters, every assumption he had built about her worth based on nothing more than her plain dress and quiet manner. "I called you an amateur," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I told a room full of people that you were performing a childhood hobby. I said it without ever once asking who you truly were." "You did," Maria said, without anger, without bitterness, simply stating what had happened. Julian turned to face the audience, his posture noticeably different from the confident, theatrical pose he had offered at the start of the evening. When he spoke, his voice carried none of its usual polish, replaced instead with something raw and unrehearsed. "I owe this woman an apology," he said, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "Not because she outplayed me tonight, though she did, more completely than I care to admit. I owe her an apology, because I judged her before I ever gave her the chance to be heard. I assumed that talent only exists where fame and titles already live, and I was wrong. Completely, embarrassingly wrong." He turned back to Maria, extending a hand toward her, an unfamiliar humility shaping his features. "I am sorry," he said simply, "for every careless word I spoke this week. You did not deserve any of it." Maria studied him for a long moment before accepting his hand, a quiet grace in the gesture that seemed to soften the tension still hanging over the hall. "Apology accepted," she said, "though I think the lesson tonight was never truly meant for me." A few scattered chuckles rippled through the audience, breaking the heavy emotion of the moment with a touch of gentle relief. Edward stepped forward once more, his own eyes still glistening with unshed tears, clearly moved by everything he had witnessed unfold on the stage he managed every single day. "I think," he said, addressing the crowd, "we have all learned something important tonight about where talent hides, and how easily we overlook it when it does not arrive wrapped in the packaging we expect." The audience applauded once more, softer this time, warmer, filled with genuine appreciation rather than mere excitement over an unexpected contest. Charlotte, still seated near the front, finally set down her pen, realizing that no amount of note-taking could fully capture the emotional weight of what had just occurred in front of her. Backstage, after the formal portion of the evening concluded, Henry Baxter approached Julian, who stood quietly near the dressing room, staring at his own reflection in the mirror, as though seeing a stranger. "That was quite a turn of events," Henry said carefully, unsure how his client might react. Julian did not answer immediately. He continued staring at his reflection, replaying the sound of Maria's performance in his mind, the way every note had carried genuine feeling rather than mere technical display. "Henry," he finally said, I have spent my entire career believing that greatness requires prestige. Tonight, a woman who spends her days scrubbing floors reminded me that greatness requires only honesty and the courage to let it be heard. Henry said nothing, sensing that his client needed the silence more than any response he could offer. Meanwhile, in the hallway outside, Grace found her mother surrounded by well-wishers, many of the same guests who had dismissed her only a week earlier, now eager to shake her hand, to offer praise, to ask questions about her past that they had never once thought to ask before. Maria accepted the attention with the same quiet grace she had carried throughout the entire evening, neither overwhelmed nor seeking more than what was freely given. "How does it feel?" Grace asked, once the crowd had thinned enough for a private moment between them. Maria considered the question carefully, her eyes still bright with the lingering emotion of the performance. "It feels," she said slowly, "like a door I thought had closed forever, has opened again. Just a little." "Just a little?" Grace asked, smiling. Maria laughed softly, a warm and genuine sound. "Perhaps more than a little," she admitted. "I had forgotten what it felt like to be truly heard." As the crowd continued to disperse into the night, discussing the unexpected turn the evening had taken, few realized that the true significance of what had happened extended far beyond a single performance. A quiet transformation had begun, not only within Julian, whose entire understanding of talent and worth had been shaken to its foundation, but within Maria herself, who had spent over 2 decades believing her chance at music had permanently passed her by. Neither of them yet knew how far the ripples from that single evening would eventually spread. In the weeks that followed the duel, the story continued to spread far beyond the walls of the Camden Concert House. Charlotte's article, published 2 days after the event, carried the headline that would soon be repeated across countless conversations throughout the city, describing not a contest of skill, but a lesson in humility that no one in attendance would soon forget. The piece was shared widely, drawing attention from readers who had never before given much thought to the quiet workers who kept concert halls and theaters running behind the scenes. Julian found himself changed in ways he had not expected. The confident, dismissive tone that once colored nearly every interview he gave had softened considerably. When reporters asked him about the evening, he no longer spoke of it as a clever bit of theater or a generous gesture on his part. Instead, he spoke honestly about the mistake he had made, about the assumptions he had carried for years without ever questioning them. "I built a career on the belief that talent belongs only to those who have already been recognized," he told one interviewer, sitting in a quiet studio far removed from the grandeur of his usual public appearances. "Maria Santos taught me, in the space of a single performance, that talent exists everywhere, often hidden by circumstances no one bothers to ask about. I am ashamed it took public embarrassment for me to learn something I should have understood long ago." Henry Baxter watched this transformation with cautious optimism, uncertain at first whether the change in his client would last beyond the initial wave of public attention. But as the weeks passed, he noticed genuine shifts in how Julian approached his work. He began arriving early to rehearsals, taking time to speak with the staff who worked behind the scenes at every venue he visited, people whose names he had never bothered to learn before. One afternoon, several weeks after the duel, Julian requested a meeting with Maria at a small cafe near the concert hall. She arrived wearing the same plain, comfortable clothing she always wore, entirely unchanged by the sudden attention that had followed her since that memorable evening. Julian, by contrast, seemed almost nervous as he waited for her at a corner table, a stack of papers set neatly in front of him. "Thank you for coming," he said, rising slightly as she approached. "You said it was important," Maria replied, taking a seat across from him. Julian slid the papers toward her, his expression a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "I have spent the past few weeks speaking with several people in the music community," he explained. "Concert organizers, conservatory directors, people who owe me a few favors after all these years. I would like to help arrange a proper return for you, a real performance, in a real concert hall, with a real audience who comes specifically to hear you play." Maria stared at the papers, a formal proposal outlining details of a solo recital scheduled for the following season, complete with a modest but respectable venue and a growing list of interested sponsors. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages, reading through details she had never allowed herself to imagine might become real again. "Julian, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he replied simply. "You deserve this chance, 23 years overdue as it may be. I cannot undo the years you lost, but I can help make sure the rest of your story unfolds differently." Maria set the papers down, her eyes glistening with emotion she made no attempt to hide. "Why are you doing this? You have already apologized. You owe me nothing further." Julian considered the question carefully before answering. "Because that night, you didn't just outplay me at the piano," he said. "You reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place, long before fame and reputation became the only things I cared about. I want to help you the way I wish someone had once helped me remember that same lesson far earlier in my own career." Maria accepted the proposal, and over the following months, preparations for her recital began in earnest. She continued working at the Camden Concert House, unwilling to abandon the place that had quietly sheltered her love of music for so many years, but she also began setting aside time each week for serious practice, working to rebuild not just her technical skill, but her confidence as a performer standing once again in front of an audience. Grace often joined her mother during these practice sessions, watching with quiet pride as Maria's playing grew stronger and more assured with each passing week. The rusty hesitation that had marked her early return to the piano gradually faded, replaced by the fluid, expressive style that had captivated an entire concert hall on the night of the duel. Julian, true to his word, remained involved throughout the process, offering guidance not as a rival or a critic, but as a genuine mentor eager to help correct the imbalance his earlier arrogance had created. He introduced Maria to respected teachers who could help refine specific techniques, connected her with organizers who could ensure her recital received proper attention, and quietly stepped back whenever necessary, careful never to overshadow the moment that truly belonged to her. Beyond his efforts to help Maria, Julian also began a broader change in how he approached his career. He started a modest mentoring program, seeking out young musicians from underprivileged backgrounds who lacked the resources or connections typically required to break into the competitive world of formal music training. He remembered, vividly, the mistake he had made in judging Maria based on her appearance and circumstances rather than her actual ability, and he resolved never to make that same error again. The program grew slowly but steadily, drawing in young students eager for guidance from someone with Julian's experience and reputation. Among the first students to join was a quiet, serious boy named Oliver, barely 14 years old, whose family could never have afforded formal piano lessons on their own. Julian recognized in Oliver a spark of genuine passion, the same kind of raw dedication he had once dismissed so carelessly in Maria, and he made certain this time not to let that spark go unnoticed. On the evening of Maria's recital, nearly a year after the fateful night of the duel, the concert hall filled once again, though this time the atmosphere carried none of the mocking curiosity that had defined the earlier event. Instead, the audience arrived with genuine anticipation, eager to witness the full return of a musician whose story had captured the attention of the entire city. Grace sat in the front row, just as she had during the duel, her heart swelling with pride as she watched her mother prepare to take the stage. Edward stood near the wings, having personally overseen every detail of the evening's arrangements, determined that nothing would diminish this long-awaited moment. Charlotte sat among the audience as well, no longer simply reporting on the story, but genuinely invested in its outcome after following Maria's journey so closely over the past year. Julian arrived quietly, choosing a seat near the back of the hall rather than a position of prominence near the stage. This night, he understood clearly, belonged entirely to Maria, and he had no wish to draw attention away from her moment, however small that attention might have been. Maria walked onto the stage to warm, welcoming applause, wearing a simple, elegant dress, her posture calm and assured. She settled at the piano, closed her eyes briefly, and began to play a program she had carefully chosen over the preceding months, a mixture of classical pieces and, as the closing selection, the very composition by Professor Alice Winters that had first revealed her hidden talent to the world. The performance unfolded with a grace and confidence that surpassed even her performance during the duel, the nervous uncertainty of that earlier night, replaced now by the settled assurance of a musician who had finally reclaimed her rightful place. When the final note faded into silence, the audience rose once again in enthusiastic applause, though this time the ovation carried none of the shock or disbelief of before, only genuine appreciation for a performer they had come specifically to celebrate. Maria stood, bowing gracefully, her eyes finding Grace in the front row, then drifting toward the back of the hall, where Julian stood among the applauding crowd, offering her a small, respectful nod. She returned the gesture with a warm smile, acknowledging, without a single word, the strange and unexpected journey that had brought them both to this moment. In the months and years that followed, Maria continued performing, slowly building a modest but respected career as a recitalist, never chasing the level of fame Julian had achieved, but finding genuine fulfillment in music that had once seemed lost to her forever. She also remained connected to the Camden Concert House, eventually taking on a role helping to identify other hidden talents among the staff and community members who might never otherwise find their way onto a proper stage. Julian, for his part, became known throughout the music community not only for his exceptional talent, but for the mentoring program that continued to grow year after year, helping young musicians like Oliver find opportunities that had once seemed entirely out of reach. He often spoke, in later interviews, about the night a woman he had once dismissed without a second thought had taught him the most important lesson of his entire career, a lesson about the true nature of talent and the danger of judging worth by appearances alone. Years later, when asked by a young journalist what advice he would offer to aspiring musicians, Julian's answer always returned to the same memory, the same quiet certainty that had settled into him since that unforgettable evening. "Never assume you know the full measure of someone's ability simply by looking at them," he would say. "Some of the greatest talent in the world spends its life waiting quietly in the shadows, tuning pianos it was once meant to play, waiting only for someone willing to listen closely enough to hear what has been there all along." And somewhere across the city, in a modest apartment filled with the sound of music once again, Maria Santos continued to play, no longer hidden, no longer waiting, her long silent dream finally, fully, alive.